We are ready to start, Joe.
Okay. My name is Joe Heim, and welcome to the monthly forum by the Chamber of Commerce. I'm going to briefly give you a quick summary of what we're going to be doing. Our new executive director is going to talk briefly. Joe Cruz is going to talk a little bit about the Oktoberfest in the Capitol. We're then going to go to myself and Anthony Chergosky to do a summary. I'm going to do a little summary of the election, and then Anthony's going to handle the analysis, the real important things, basically. We are going to open it up for questions. Maggie, do you have questions in advance, or am I going to provide them, or what?
We do not. So for all the attendees, you can submit your questions in the Q&A box or the chat box at the bottom.
Okay, about 1 o'clock, then we will conclude the forum. We'll kind of keep it on pace. So I've already said welcome to all of you, and I'd like to welcome the new Chamber Chief Executive Officer, Neil Zigerlicki. Neil?
Thanks, Joe. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, welcome to the forum. I am glad so many of you are able to join us and attend today's event. Today marks the beginning of week number 2 for me being at the Chamber. So far, I've had a very, very warm welcome from the community, and it's appreciated. Before we get started, I want to say thank you to our Chamber staff for setting up and organizing this event. They're a fantastic team, and I am very excited to work with them. For our members and those in attendance today, I look forward to connecting and working with you over the coming weeks and months. Joe, you can take it from here. I'm looking forward to hearing all the information today.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Next on the agenda is Joe Cruz, going to give us a quick update on the Oktoberfest in the Capitol, an event we did by Zoom last month. And let's go ahead, Joe.
Sure. Thanks, Joe. So the Oktoberfest in the Capitol this year was virtual Oktoberfest. It did not taste as good as it has in the past. Well, usually we'd have a glass of beer and something to eat in Madison, but that didn't work out this year, obviously. Wednesday, October 7th was the day. It turned out to be an excellent day. Our position paper, we wanted to focus on a handful of key issues facing the Coulee region. One of the top items, and actually an item that we talked with most of the directors of departments about, was the critical issue of broadband coverage of the region and making sure that our entire region has good high-speed internet access. We also spent some time talking about transportation and a couple of key road projects here in the Coulee region. We also, I think a very important part of the day was thanking directors of key departments for key projects here. For example, the Prairie Springs Science Center here at UWL in La Crosse, residence halls at UWL. And of course, one of the things that we were really proud of was the work that's being done and the state funding for the renovations and expansions of our convention center in downtown La Crosse. So we were able to do that and offer those thanks and build some relationships with key departments. The departments that we met with, in some cases it was the secretary, and in other cases the secretary delegated the meeting to their key staff. We met with the Department of Transportation Secretary Craig Thompson, Public Service Commission. We did meet with Chairperson Rebecca Cameron Volk. The Department of Administration, Secretary Joel Brennan was with us. We met with the Department of Children and Family Services, Secretary Emily Almanson. That was a very interesting and productive discussion about the challenges across the state with early childhood and daycare services. Department of Health was also an amazing discussion. Unfortunately, Andrea Palm was unable to join us, but we did have a great discussion with Deputy Secretary Julie Wellams. And then we concluded the day with a great discussion and informative discussion with the Workforce Development Department and Public Instruction. All of these were rich discussions, and I would have to say that all of the people that we talked to really appreciated us reaching out to them and bringing to them the key issues that we have identified facing businesses and the community as a whole here in Western Wisconsin. That's my report, Joe, on the Oktoberfest of the Capitol. And just a couple of closing comments. I want to recognize the sponsors of that event: Darylyn Power, First Supply and Gerhard's Kitchens and Bath, Gunderson Health System, ISG Engineer and Architects, Quick Trip, and Mayo Clinic Health System in La Crosse. Thank you. And next year we will be in Madison, we're anticipating, and we will be meeting with our elected officials in October of 2021. Please join us.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate your comments. Next, we're going to talk about the elections, the main topic for today. I'm going to provide a quick summary, then Anthony Chergosky from UW-La Crosse. He's an assistant professor of political science. He's a political analyst for WKBT and a very widely quoted source of information these days. So I appreciate that. We have a summary. The national, I think probably everybody knows what's going on. The margin between the two candidates is about 4 to 5 million. You may remember that 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote with 3 million, so that's actually expanded somewhat. It looks like the president's going to end up with around 306 electoral votes, almost identical, if I remember right, identical to that of which the president had. There's 3 states that are still out, but it's pretty clear where they're going: North Carolina, Alaska, and Georgia. Georgia looks like it's ahead for Biden. And the US Senate and the House of Representatives, probably one of the bigger surprises of the election is the Senate is basically up for grabs, but it looks like there's at least an even chance, if not better, that the Republicans will maintain control. This is based on 2 seats that are going to be runoff seats in early January in the state of Georgia. In the House of Representatives, I think the Democrats widely thought they were going to pick up seats. They did not. They actually lost 7 seats, but they've still retained their majority, but it's going to be a narrower majority. National turnout was around 63 to 65%. It's still a little low, but it may in fact be a new record. It is said that this could be the biggest record since 2000, or excuse me, 1000. I'm sorry, 1900. Gotta get this right. But anyway, it's a massive turnout on both the Democratic and Republican sides for the candidates. In the state of Wisconsin, Joe Biden carried the state with about a 20,000 vote margin. That is less than 1%, by the way. It's going to be like 28.5 to 28.0. It's very close. What he did, however, is swings about roughly 42,000 votes from Hillary. Hillary lost the state by 20,000 votes. Donald Trump obviously carried first time in some time. In terms of the legislature, I think many of you know that the goal for the Republicans was to come up with a veto-proof margin in both the Senate and the Assembly. That did not occur. In the Senate, the Republicans did pick up 2 seats. They missed the third one in Wisconsin, about 600 votes in the 32nd Senate district. In the Assembly, the Republicans lost 2 seats, but it went from 63 to 61 to 39 margin. So it's still pretty substantial. Turnout statewide was 73%. It is a record or very close to the record that we've held in the state. In locally, 3rd Congressional District, Congressman Ron Kine won re-election. I will tell you that that was a closest election I think he's had since he's been in Congress. He won with 51.7% of the vote to Derek Van Orden's 48.3. That was a margin of 12,600. Interesting part to me is that the margin that Ron Kine had in the county of La Crosse was 13,700. In other words, you can make a claim that Ron Kine carrying the county of La Crosse actually won the election for him. So I thought that was pretty interesting. In the state legislative races, Lauren Pfaff very narrowly beat Dan Kapanke. Margin was about 589 votes. That is close. Pfaff had 50.3% of the vote, Kapanke 49.7%. And that was, as I said, one of the key races in the Senate to try to come up with a supermajority. Steve Doyle won re-election, 52.4% over 45 over Kevin Hoyer. His margin was 26.48, 2,640, which is his district, by the way. It looks, at least a preliminary look, like the district itself actually went for Donald Trump. Not surprising, maybe because he was in West Salem. Jill Billings had first ran against Jerome Gunderson, first opponent she's had in years. She won with about 2-to-1 margin. It was not close. Lauren Oldenburg won also on 60-40 over an 18-year-old Josephine Janes. So he was a first-term moderate Republican, and he won re-election pretty handily. So that's kind of a summary of the local races. I'll now turn it over to Anthony for his analysis. Anthony, go right ahead.
Thanks so much, Joe Heim. I appreciate you inviting me to be here, and I appreciate the Chamber for inviting me to be here. It's always a pleasure to get to talk to this group, and it's always such a pleasure to be involved with what's going on with the La Crosse Area Chamber of Commerce. So thanks to everyone for inviting me today, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you because I've got some slides to go through. So I'm going to kind of just buzz through some of the things that Joe Heim discussed in his overview of election results. I'm going to look through, first of all, so just some basic results. You see the Electoral College map there. This I pulled from the New York Times. I think some media outlets have Arizona called. I think the Associated Press and Fox News have Arizona called for Donald Trump. So you would just add 11 electoral votes to Joe Biden's 279, move that up to 290. You do see the popular vote margin is fairly substantial, at least for this quite divisive age that we're in. Joe Biden looks on track to carry over 50% of the popular vote and will defeat Donald Trump in the popular vote by over 3 percentage points. Meanwhile, as Joe Heim pointed out, the Democrats are on pace to maintain control of the House of Representatives, 23 seats remaining to be called, 216 in the Democratic Party's column. They need 218, so just 2 more. Looks like they're on pace to lose a few seats, but nevertheless maintain majority control. In the Senate, we're at 48-48, but it looks like we're heading toward a 48-50 margin, a 48 Democrat, 50 Republican margin with 2 outstanding special elections, I should say runoffs, in Georgia. In the Wisconsin State Legislature, as Joe pointed out, the Democrats gained 2 seats in the state assembly. The Republicans gained 2 seats in the state Senate, falling short of that key 2/3 majority, that key veto-proof majority in both chambers. Locally, and what Joe just said about the West Salem rally, I did want to key in on that for just a moment. There's some hot off the press political science research today that studied Donald Trump's campaign rallies in the 2016 election and found that they did indeed produce some effects locally, that they produced more enthusiasm and more of an intent to vote for Donald Trump among people who lean Republican and among strong Republicans. So the Trump rallies didn't appear to flip Democrats over to Team Trump. They didn't appear to pull undecided voters off the fence, but they definitely did help among voters who might lean in the Republican direction. And so what Joe is saying is entirely plausible about the West Salem rally potentially making a difference in how the presidential vote shook out in that particular area. Of course, we see that Steve Doyle won re-election, we see that Jill Billings won re-election, and we see that Lauren Oldenburg won re-election as well. Then, as Joe pointed out, in an extremely close race for the state Senate between Brad Pfaff and Dan Kapanke, coming down to just a few hundred votes. Ron Kind facing an unusually competitive race. I've gotten a lot of questions about what Ron Kind's political future holds, given his difficulty in winning this election. I have no idea what his political future holds, but certainly I've gotten that question asked to me on multiple occasions since this result came in. One way that I like to approach election analysis is to consider whether this election was a change election or was it an election that is better characterized by continuity? Was it mostly change or was it mostly continuity when you compare this election to the last one? I think it's fair to say that when you go from 2012 to 2016, that was a change election. And I'm going to show you some evidence for that in just a moment. But when you go from 2016 to 2020, it appears to be more an election characterized by continuity, more of an election characterized by what didn't change, as opposed to what did change in how voters behaved and in how the results shook out. Now, some of my evidence for claiming that this is an election of continuity is, first of all, that Wisconsin was extremely close. I have the margin here between the two parties in this column, and you'll note that of the last 6 presidential elections in Wisconsin, 4 of them have been decided by a margin of less than 1 percentage point, and 2020 marks another one in that column, a 0.63 margin. So one reason that this is an election of continuity is, oh, big shocker, big surprise, right? Wisconsin is extremely competitive, extremely close. That is nothing new. One reason that this is an election of continuity. Another reason that I might claim that this is an election of continuity is that Wisconsin looks like it will turn out to be the tipping point state. The tipping point state is the state that provides the winner of the electoral vote with the decisive electoral votes. In other words, which state gets the electoral vote winner over the hump, over that magic number of 270 votes, the magic number that you need in order to win a presidential election. You can see here that Biden's win got him to 270. So Wisconsin was indeed the tipping point state, the state that provided Biden with the decisive electoral votes to get him over the 270 hump. Now, I say that this is evidence for an election of continuity because this was expected for a very long time. I mean, this has been expected basically since the 2016 election. We've known since the 2016 election that there was a very, very good chance that Wisconsin would be the tipping point state. Indeed, it was. Another reason that this is an election of continuity is that the pivot counties didn't pivot back. When you look at these counties, this map, the orange counties are what we would call pivot counties. They voted twice for Obama and then voted for Trump in 2016. So they voted Democrat in 2008 and 2012 and then voted Republican in 2016. Almost all of those pivot counties stayed in the Trump column. A big question was, would the pivot counties pivot back? Having voted twice for Obama and then for Trump, would they pivot back and then vote for Biden in 2020? The answer is no. By and large, they did not pivot back. They stayed in the Trump column. So it's just more of the same when you look from 2016 to 2020. Only 2 counties flipped from 2016 to 2020. Dorr and Sauk were the only counties that flipped from red to blue, from majority one party to majority the other party. In this case, they went from voting for Donald Trump in 2016 to voting for Biden in 2020. Now that's only 2, though. That's only 2 counties out of all of the counties. And there were far more counties in 2016 that flipped compared to 2012. And that's why I think that 2016 was much more of a change election, while 2020 was much more of a continuity election. Indeed, every single other county in Wisconsin either stayed red or stayed blue when you look at the 2016 results compared to the 2020 results. Now, when you look at the difference from 2012 to 2016, you get a much different story. 23 out of the 72 counties flipped. And in this case, they all flipped from blue Democrat to red Republican. So you had a lot more counties flipping in the 2012 to 2016 elections compared to when we move from 2016 to 2020. There continues to be an education gap among white voters, yet more evidence that this is an election of continuity. These are the exit poll results from Wisconsin, and I want to key in on these first 2 rows here. Among white college graduates, they favored Biden 56% to 43%, so plus 13 for Biden among white college graduates. Among white non-college graduates, you have it almost reversed, where 57% of this crowd voted for Donald Trump, 41% of them voted for Joe Biden. So you have plus 13 for this crowd, plus 16 for this crowd, plus 13 Biden, plus 16 Trump. And this is a continuation of a large education gap that we have seen among whites with and without a college degree. You can see that there didn't used to be an education gap among these white voters with and without a college degree. In 1992 and 1996, it didn't really make a difference in how you voted, your educational attainment. But then we see that whites without a college degree really move towards the Republican Party starting in 2000. They stay there through 2016, and now we know they stayed there through 2020. Meanwhile, you had this enormous shift among whites with a college degree. They voted for Romney in 2012 by a margin of 14 points, then voted for Clinton by a margin of 15 points, a swing of 29 points, truly one of the most remarkable aspects of the 2016 election. And that seems to have continued into the 2020 election. Another piece of continuity, the rural-urban divide is a defining feature of Wisconsin politics. Just these stark political divisions, and certainly these divisions go beyond politics, the stark divisions between rural and urban Wisconsin, that continues to be a central feature of our state's politics. I'll show you a map here that looks at the Evers-Walker vote in 2018 and then the Biden-Trump vote in 2020. Then we can look at which counties became more Democrat when you compare these two elections, and which counties became more Republican when you look at these two elections. Now, what I see here is a whole lot of red, meaning that most counties voted more Republican in 2020 compared to 2018. The Republican vote increased in most counties when you compare 2020 to 2018. Now, a lot of rural in these counties, a lot of rural in these red counties that became more Republican. You do interestingly, and we're going to get to this in a moment, you do interestingly see some blue here, where Biden improved over Tony Evers, and those counties are very much clustered in southeastern Wisconsin. Another graph to show you the relationship between population density and vote choice in the 2020 election. This is for all counties in the 2020 election. And what we're looking here is population density on the x-axis. So as we get further along the x-axis, we get more densely populated areas. And then we have the swing from Democrat to Republican vote share. So if we get above 0, it means that this particular area swung toward Biden. If we get below 0, it means that a particular area swung towards Trump when you compare 2020 to 2016. And what you find, and it's messy data, but if you draw kind of a line of best fit in this messy bunch of data, you find that there is indeed a correlation here between how densely populated an area is and its swing towards the Democratic Party. Meaning that the less densely populated an area is, the more it swung towards the Republicans in 2020. The more densely populated an area is, the more it swung towards the Democrats in 2020. So the urban-rural divide is certainly a defining feature of politics and a whole lot more in Wisconsin, but it's not unique to Wisconsin. I think it's particularly pronounced in Wisconsin. I think it's a particularly salient feature of politics in Wisconsin, the urban-rural divide, but it's happening everywhere. So I don't want to give you the wrong impression. So if this was mainly an election of continuity, then why did Trump lose Wisconsin this time, right? I mean, he won Wisconsin in 2016, he lost it in 2020, what gives? Well, you can basically narrow this down to two key explanations. Shifts towards the Democrats in the suburbs, and then a truly massive margin for Joe Biden in Dane County. A truly massive margin to the extent that he netted 35,000 more votes in Dane than Clinton did in 2016. In other words, Biden's overall state margin was padded by 35,000 more votes than was the case for Clinton, simply because of what happened in Dane County. So that was absolutely huge when you are looking at explanations for the Biden win. You also have to look at Biden's performance in the suburbs. First, let me give you a look at the Dane County numbers. So you can see that Donald Trump's overall vote went up from 71,000 to 79,000, but Biden's vote went way up in Dane County from 217,000 for Hillary Clinton to over 260,000 votes for Joe Biden. Plus, you had Joe Biden's overall share of the vote increase over Hillary Clinton in Dane County, 70.4% of the vote for Clinton compared to 75.5% for Biden in Dane County in 2020. Then when we look at the suburbs and the WOW counties, when we look at the Milwaukee suburbs, we can see a pretty stark difference. And it's not the sense that Biden won these suburbs. It's the sense that the margin moved in the right direction for him. So the vote share in the Milwaukee suburbs was 56% Trump, 40% Clinton. You see that Biden narrowed this down to a 9-point margin from a 16-point margin in 2016 to a 9-point margin in 2020. Another piece of continuity, by the way, if we look at Milwaukee itself and not just the suburbs of Milwaukee, if we just narrow in on the city of Milwaukee, we find more of the same when you look at 2020 and 2016. There was a lot of talk about the Democrats' turnout problem in Milwaukee, how there were going to be renewed mobilization efforts, how there were going to be efforts to fix the turnout problem in Milwaukee, but the numbers speak for themselves, and it was ultimately a pretty flat turnout in Milwaukee itself. So ultimately, as Craig Gilbert from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel puts it, the Democrats won Wisconsin without fixing their two glaring problems. The fact that they experienced massive rural losses and they had soft turnout in Milwaukee. None of those problems was fixed for the Democratic Party. They lost big time in rural counties, and they also had soft turnout in Milwaukee yet again. But Donald Trump didn't fix his key 2016 problem, the suburbs. So ultimately, you had two sides that didn't really fix their central problems from 2016. So both parties emerged from this election with important problems and questions. For the Republicans, they have a serious and growing Dane County problem because Dane County is very much a growing county population-wise. And as Dane County grows in population, it also seems to be growing in the vote share for Democrats. So the Republicans can run up massive margins in rural Wisconsin, but then get absolutely crushed in Dane County. So this is becoming a serious problem for the Republican Party, that they're just getting swamped in Dane County. And so that basically is just canceling out their huge margins that they're running up in rural Wisconsin. And then a big question for them is, can their erosion in the suburbs be reversed? Can they bounce back in the suburbs after a couple tough election cycles for them in suburban Wisconsin? And I should note, suburban everywhere in the United States. The Democrats, without question, face an increasingly dire situation in rural Wisconsin. Rural Wisconsin has been moving consistently in the Republican Party's direction, and it is not turning around for the Democratic Party. So what's their next move in rural Wisconsin? And swingy Western Wisconsin did not swing back. And I think for many, this was a surprise. I think many assumed that if Joe Biden were to win the state of Wisconsin, it would mean that he did well in Western Wisconsin, that he swung back a swingy part of the state. It didn't happen. Donald Trump really improved in lots of areas in Western Wisconsin, really improved over his 2016 numbers. What now for the Democrats? What now? When swingy Western Wisconsin did not swing back in their direction, where do they go from here? The Republicans maintained strong majorities in the Wisconsin state legislature. Again, they fell short of that key 2/3 majority, and this is for two reasons: a durable gerrymander and geographic clustering of Democratic voters. And I say that both of these explanations are very important, and you have to have them both. in order to kind of get a handle on why Republicans have had so much success lately in state legislative elections. Their gerrymander coming out of redistricting after the 2010 census was enormously effective. One of the most durable and one of the best gerrymanders that I and a number of other political scientists have seen. Now, sometimes gerrymanders can come undone because people move around, there are geographic shifts, certain areas might trend toward one party or the other. But what we've seen is that this gerrymander has remained durable for the entire decade in terms of protecting the Republican Party's majority in the Wisconsin state legislature. But Republicans, will say, you also have to look at how Democratic voters are clustered into a small number of districts. And that is easy to do when Democrats are already geographically clustered in terms of where they live. So the whole name of the game with gerrymandering is to cram the opposing party supporters into a small number of districts. It's easy to do that when they're already clustered, right? I mean, you can cram them into a small number of districts when they're already clustered together. It makes the job of a gerrymandering way easier. And indeed, Democratic voters are becoming increasingly clustered in urban areas. So when you add these two things together, you get a strong GOP edge in the battle for the Wisconsin state legislature. When you account for the very effective gerrymander plus the geographic clustering of Democratic voters. We saw a big change in voter turnout, as Joe Heim mentioned, about a 6-point increase nationwide in voter turnout. We saw that this comes on the heels of a large increase in voter turnout in the 2018 election. One thing that this reveals is that Donald Trump mobilized both sides. He mobilized his opponents and his supporters alike. We see that in 2018, we see that in 2020, certainly. So Donald Trump might be kind of like a unique factor here. I'm not sure if we'll continue to see these high turnout elections in the future, because Donald Trump just seems to have a way of mobilizing not just his own supporters, but those on the other side. Meanwhile, the Democrats had a disappointing performance in their competition for Congress. I want to key in on their share, on the popular vote share they received in the House elections. That's this kind of solid gray line. You can see that their share of the popular vote in nationwide in House elections went down from in 2020 compared to 2018. And indeed, their share of seats is going down as well. So I think that's something that the Democrats are going to have to wrestle with. Why did they lose seats in the House of Representatives when they were really thinking that they would in fact gain seats? So I think I'm going to go through some unanswered questions that I have about this election. And the first unanswered question that I'm going to shoot your way is, why did so many Democrats down the ballot fall short of Joe Biden's numbers? I'm going to illustrate this with a couple key examples. First, I'm going to look at a district in the Omaha area, which I think illustrates this House presidential divide quite well. It's an urban-suburban district in Nebraska, and you can see that it voted for Biden by about 7 points, but then voted for the Republican candidate for House by about 4 or 5 points. So that means that there was a significant number of people who voted for Biden, the Democrat, and then Bacon, the Republican candidate for House. Quite a few people must have split their tickets, so to speak. So this is something that I think Democrats are going to have to wrestle with. Why did they see results like this, where Biden wins this area, but their House candidate loses this area? And then if we look at Wisconsin, if we add up all of the votes for the US House of Representatives in Wisconsin, we actually find that the Republicans won that statewide vote 51.4% to 48.6%. So in the overall vote for House of Representatives in Wisconsin, the Republicans got more votes than the Democrats got. Of course, Biden won Wisconsin by a small margin. So what you find is that the Republican candidates for Congress overperformed Donald Trump, and the Democratic candidates for Congress underperformed Joe Biden. Why exactly did that happen? I don't know, but I think it's an important question for the Democrats to wrestle with. One potential explanation is that the socialism and the defund the police attacks were effective lines of attack against them. And this is something that came up in a recent call held among House Democrats with a Congresswoman named Abigail Spanberger of Virginia, a moderate Democrat, who says that the number one concern that people were bringing to her was defund the police. And that, you know, some of her colleagues would say, oh, it's just the language of the street, we should respect that. But she says that it was still a mistake to use that type of rhetoric. We're supposed to talk about things in the way where we mean what we're talking about. If we don't mean we should defund the police, we shouldn't say that. And Spanberger goes on to say, we need to not ever use the words socialist or socialism ever again. Certainly her experience in her swing district was that these attacks left a mark, defunding the police and socialism, that those attacks moved the needle against her. Now, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who comes from the more liberal wing of the Democratic Party, says, well, not a single member of Congress that she's aware of campaigned on socialism or defunding the police in this election. In fact, she points the finger at Democrats' weak party operation, a party operation that, in her view, was simply not resilient to Republican attacks, a party operation, in her view, that simply did not have the strength to respond to Republican attacks. So there's some infighting going on within the Democratic Party. And so one of my unanswered questions is, to what extent can the different factions of the Democratic Party just get along with each other? Because there's a large group of moderates in the Democratic Party, there's a large group of progressives in the Democratic Party in Congress, there are people all in between those two factions. Can they get along in the Biden era? Why did the polls miss again? It happened again. And I've been in the very lonely position, it certainly felt like a lonely position, of defending the polling industry over the last 4 years. I felt reasonably confident that the polling industry had figured out why it got things wrong in 2016. That is to say, why the swing state polls really did not pick up a bunch of Trump supporters, why they understated Donald Trump's level of support. But you can see that they missed again. The polling average, for example, in Wisconsin, the average of polls had Biden winning by 6.7 points. In Wisconsin, the actual margin was 0.7, so the polls missed by about 6 points in Wisconsin. There are a lot of hard questions that the polling industry needs to answer about why it missed yet again, why it missed again in terms of understating Donald Trump's level of support. Well, the next 2 years essentially look like the last 2 years in Wisconsin state government, because Republicans didn't get their veto-proof majority. The veto is still very much in play. And so we're left with 2 more years that look kind of like the last 2 years, right? I mean, in the sense that we have a Democratic governor, we have Republicans with significant majorities in both chambers of the state legislature, but not to the extent that they can override the veto of Governor Evers. So will these next 2 years essentially be a continuation of the last 2 years in Wisconsin state government? What lessons does the Republican Party learn from an election where they outperformed expectations down the ballot? I mean, there's no question that the Republican Party outperformed expectations in congressional races. Like, no one was expecting the Republicans to actually gain seats. Very few people were expecting the Republicans to actually gain seats in the House of Representatives. And certainly the Republicans kind of pulled off their best case scenario, it looks like, when it comes to the balance of power in the Senate. But they lost the ultimate prize. And this is part of a pattern. The Republicans have lost the popular vote in 7 of the 8 most recent presidential elections. The only one of these where they won the popular vote was W. Bush's reelect in 2004. Otherwise, from 1992 through the present, Republicans have lost the popular vote in every presidential election. Now, due to the Electoral College, they still won 3 of those 8 elections, Bush in 2000 and Trump in 2016. But where do you go from here if you're the Republican Party? And like, what is your interpretation of these results? I mean, Biden is going to win by a non-trivial margin. He's going to win this election fairly convincingly. But the Republican Party did well in other races, yet we have this here, where Republicans have now lost the popular vote in 7 of the 8 most recent presidential elections. Where does the party go from here? What does the party learn from this election? And what does now, through the inauguration date, January 20th, what does now look like through the 20th? What does that look like in terms of the governmental response to COVID-19? What happens in these next 70-ish days? What about government funding and the debt ceiling? We have government funding running out in early December. I think it's December 11th that that funding runs out and we'd have a shutdown. So what does that look like in a Trump lame duck? What does that look like in just a lame duck overall, where you need to pass a measure to keep the government open, and then the debt ceiling is looming again next summer, where we'll hit the debt ceiling, and then what will be done? Will there be any kind of action taken on that during the lame duck? Will that be kicked to Biden's first several months in office? We shall see. Will people accept the election as legitimate? And this is a big concern that I have. Will large amounts of people just believe that this election was fraudulent, that this election was stolen, that there was widespread voter fraud? Will people just have these sort of misconceptions about the election that leads them to not view the election outcome as legitimate? What does the presidential transition look like when it seems, from Donald Trump, who is still not conceding defeat, to Joe Biden, who's very much a creature of Washington? What does that transition look like? I've heard that the best transition that a respected scholar of American politics, Norm Ornstein, the best transition that he saw was from Bush to Obama in 2008. What will the transition look like this time? Will it be a smooth transition or not? And what does President Trump's rhetoric look like from here on out? I want to point to some recent tweets that have been hidden by Twitter because it might be misleading about an election or other civic process. These allegations of voter fraud, widespread voter fraud, for which there is no credible evidence, at least at the moment. So you actually have to click to view Trump's tweets instead of just viewing them automatically, because Twitter has flagged these tweets as spreading misinformation. So ultimately, here's where we're at. Divided government at the state and probably the national levels. So back to divided government. A worsening pandemic. A situation that looks really dire when you look at the pandemic. Just look at these graphs. I mean, testing is increasing, but cases are increasing at a faster rate, to the point where the nation has averaged over 100,000 cases per day throughout the last week. You can see hospitalizations continue to go up. The deaths are creeping up as well. We had a 33% positivity rate in Wisconsin yesterday. And as this reporter from the New York Times points out, tells us that we have inadequate testing and that this virus is out of control. What happens now? The US has surpassed 10 million COVID cases, and this absolutely knocked my socks off, this statistic. 1 in 441 Americans have tested positive just in the last week. That I almost fell out of my chair when I read that, because this is like a week's worth of testing. 1 in 441 Americans testing positive in just the last week. Scott Gottlieb, a very prominent, was a Trump administration official and now has become a prominent commentator about COVID-19, says that we're going to be at the apex of this thing when the president-elect takes office in late January. He says this isn't going to be over in 2021, but predicts next year will be much better. We have a number of key executive orders on tap for Biden when he enters office in January, a number of executive orders that are aimed at undoing some of Donald Trump's policies as president, rejoining the Paris Climate Accords, reversing the withdrawal from the World Health Organization, repealing certain immigration restrictions, and then reinstating DACA, the immigration program for people who arrived here as when they were young. So those executive orders appear to be on tap quite early, perhaps even in the first day of the Biden administration. An uncertain future faces Obamacare. It heads back to the Supreme Court yet again, and oral arguments will be held tomorrow in this case, and the future of Obamacare once again hangs in the balance before the Supreme Court. It's basically a sequel to the case in 2012. It concerns the individual mandate, the penalty that people must pay if they do not have health insurance. Under the 2012 ruling, it was a 5-4 ruling that upheld the individual mandate, said that it was constitutional on the grounds that the individual mandate was allowed under Congress's power to tax. Now, we have a situation where the individual mandate is once again at question, once again at issue in this case, because the Republicans zeroed out the individual mandate. They said that the individual mandate would be zero. And so if there's a $0 penalty for not having insurance, then the individual mandate is still technically in the law. I mean, the individual mandate itself was not removed from Obamacare. It's just that it essentially was. I mean, just in practical terms, it was, because the penalty was set to zero. The new challenge starts with the argument that this made the individual mandate unconstitutional because it could no longer be considered a tax. In legal terms, the challengers to Obamacare argue that the mandate cannot be severed from the rest of the law. Removing the mandate means the entire law must fall. That is the argument that the Supreme Court is considering. We have a looming showdown over redistricting. I don't need to tell this group certainly about the importance of that following the completion of the 2020 census, a looming showdown over redistricting, this time with divided government and with the Republicans lacking a veto-proof majority in the state legislature. I want to close with this. A famous story, Philadelphia, 1787, when the Constitution was being written, that hot summer in Philadelphia. Ben Franklin was asked, what do we have, a republic or a monarchy? And Franklin replied, a republic, if you can keep it. Can we keep the republic? Can we keep the republic in the midst of these incredible challenges that we face? A once-in-a-century pandemic that has put enormous strain on any number of institutions in the United States. Can we keep the republic in the midst of what I view as truly unsustainable levels of partisanship and polarization, unsustainable levels of conflict between the two parties, unsustainable degrees of division between the two parties? Can we keep the republic in the midst of a media environment that may prevent Americans from having a shared understanding of facts and reality, where we can basically choose our own reality? We can choose our own set of facts. Can a democracy survive in that situation? What does that mean for democracy when Americans, through social media, through choosing sources of information that confirm what they already believe, does that put democracy in peril? And divided government, both at the state level and the national level, most likely, and incentives to inflame conflict rather than find common ground. Incentives to maybe deny Biden certain legislative victories, to not cooperate with the other side, because you want to create a stark contrast when you are up for election in 2022. A really brilliant but disturbing finding in recent political science research, or a very disturbing and important argument, is that parties have incentives to inflame conflict because they want the stakes to be high. They want to give people a reason to vote for them. If you cooperate with the other party, what are voters, why would they vote for you if you're just going to cooperate with the other party? If you're going to be Republican light instead of full-on Republican, if you're going to be Democrat light instead of full-on Democrat, do voters reward finding common ground as opposed to inflaming conflict? I'm really skeptical about that. I think that there are more rewards for inflaming conflict rather than finding common ground. But I will end on a positive note, a potential game-changing announcement from Pfizer this morning about an effective COVID-19 vaccine, potentially, which could hopefully make 2021 much better than 2020 has, even in the midst of these enormous challenges that the country faces coming out of election 2020. So thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Thanks so much.
Anthony, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I gotcha.
Okay, couple questions that have come in. Let me just check here. First question, in Wisconsin, COVID was the #1 issue. The economy was second. Nationally, it seemed like the economy was more of a plus for Trump. What might explain that difference?
I think Donald Trump has long been viewed as strong on the economy, and that comes back to his strong economic numbers back when, I mean, really during the first 3 years of his term in office. And I think voters were willing to give him some credit for that. And not willing to, and maybe not willing to draw that connection between his handling of the coronavirus pandemic and the economic conditions. I think, you know, many people were remembering kind of the good times in the first 3 years of Trump's presidency. There's no doubt, Joe, that the economy worked in Donald Trump's favor, which makes it all the more remarkable that he lost. Because normally, I mean, like, if a presidential candidate has the edge on the economy, they'll win.
Okay. Second question from one in the audience. If polls are inaccurate, do they still have any value?
So this is where I think the public opinion survey industry really needs to do a full accounting of why the polls missed again. And I'm going to still be a defender of the polls. I do think that they have value, but I think that there are some real problems with the polling industry. And these problems need urgent resolutions because we need to know what the public thinks about politics, right? I mean, in a representative democracy, having a good handle on public opinion is so important. So I'm going to reserve judgment until I kind of get more of an idea of what went wrong. But I do think that the public and everyone is owed an accounting of why exactly there was a miss this time.
Okay, thanks. One other question, or two questions. Thoughts on Trumpism. Will it continue to influence the GOP, or will fade or evolve over time, a la heroism or Tea Party, etc.?
Yeah, Joe, I think that comes down to the lessons learned from this election among the Republican Party. You know, like, based on the presidential loss, but the gains in Congress, what lessons does that teach the party? I'm going to be incredibly curious to know, or to get a sense of how Republicans inside the party are understanding this result. Because I mean, I can certainly offer my take, but I think my take is much less important than how the people inside the party are interpreting what message this election is sending.
Okay, last question. This has to do with campaign strategy. As you know, the president was very active the last 10 days or so on rallies across the country, whereas Biden was following the social distancing strategy. Do you think that made much of a difference in the campaign, in other words, campaign strategies of the two sides?
I do, Joe, and that's based on this article about the 2016 Trump rallies that did show a slight but noticeable effect in Trump support in the localities where rallies were held. So it wouldn't have made a huge difference. I mean, we shouldn't sort of fool ourselves. Like, rallies don't, make massive differences, but Trump seemed to have the ability to at least slightly move the needle with his rallies in 2016, and I'm sure the same was true in 2020.
Okay, I guess I think it's sneaking one more question here. How about information on projected GDP and clarifying what Trump achieved relative to where it was prior to him, even with a historic tax cut? I'm not sure. I think he's talking about maybe the person is talking about the GDP over the last 3 years versus say the last 3 years of
Sure.
the Obama administration.
Well, I mean, I can say that will probably go down as the signature legislative achievement of the Trump presidency, the tax cut, and certainly the judges that Donald Trump got confirmed working with Mitch McConnell. Joe, I think this is interesting because the tax cut and the conservative judges are things that any Republican president would have done. So in some ways, this was Donald Trump conforming to the Republican Party, or at least the Republican establishment really pushing its priorities on Donald Trump and making sure that he prioritized these sort of typical Republican priorities, even though in many ways he was very much an atypical president.
Okay, well, that pretty well concludes our forum today. I'd like to thank Anthony, first of all, for being here and with an extremely interesting, and it's just not political science. I think this is a great presentation. So thank you very much, Anthony.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank the sponsors, Cooley of the of the forum, Cooley Bank, Darylyn Power, Gensler, Gunderson Health System, Verve, Mayo Clinic Health System, Quick Trip, and ISG. And I'd like to thank the participants who joined us today and thank the Chamber for running this forum. Thanks very much.